Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Philadelphia Commission for Women for what we expect to be an engaging conversation with our guest, Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin, for the opening program of our Women's History Month series. Today's topic captures the theme, the long march to the White House. I'm Javita Hill, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Philadelphia Commission for Women and the Mayor's Office of Engagement for Women. Our office is responsible for providing advice and recommendations to the mayor, city council, and the city's public policymakers on issues of gender equity and social justice. To this extent, at full capacity, we are comprised of 27 appointed members. Each of 17 council members appoints a commissioner, and the mayor appoints 10 people. So, since 2016, when we were established by a ballot initiative and unanimously voted to approve, our priority policy agenda has included addressing the gender wage gap, raising the minimum wage, maternal mortality disparities, domestic workers' Bill of Rights, and fair workweek scheduling for workers in the hospitality, fast food, and retail industries. This program is the opening of our month-long series, Your Voice, Your Power, Your Vote, Making Democracy Work. A full schedule of our virtual events is in the chat. Please use the Q&A function to put your questions to be addressed during the Q&A portion of this program. So I would now like to introduce our speaker for today. And I am so proud to have such an illustrious academic and historian on our to be with us today. Tomiko Brown-Nagin is Dean of the Harvard Radcliff Institute, Daniel P.S. Paul Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School, and member of the History Department at the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. An award-winning legal historian and an expert in constitutional law and education law and policy, she is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Law Institute, and the American Philosophical Society. She's a fellow of the American Bar Foundation, and she is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. A frequent lecturer and media commentator about issues in law, history, and higher education, Brown-Nagin has published articles and book chapters on a wide range of topics, including the Supreme Court's equal protection jurisprudence, civil rights law and history, the Affordable Care Act, and education reform. Her 2011 book, Courage to Dissent, Atlanta and a Long History of the Civil Rights Movement, won 6 awards, including the Bancroft Prize in U.S. History. And in her latest book, Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley and the Struggle for Equality, Brown-Nagin explores the life and times of one of my sheroes, Judge Constance Baker Motley, the path-breaking lawyer, politician, and judge. Welcome, Dean Brown-Nagin.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Javita, and for serving as my interlocutor. And thanks to the Philadelphia Commission for Women for hosting me today, and to the events team who organized this event. I am delighted to be with you and to discuss one of my sheroes, Constance Baker Motley. And I'm going to begin with a reading from a chapter of my book, which is about Constance Baker Motley's most famous case. That was the battle to desegregate the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. This man has got to be crazy, Thurgood Marshall yelled to Motley in January of 1961. That's your case. Marshall had descended upon Motley's office waving a letter from James Meredith. The missive contained such a preposterous idea that Marshall thought the writer must be out of his mind. I am submitting an application for admission to the University of Mississippi, Meredith wrote, and I am anticipating encountering difficulty with the various agencies here in the state. In view of the brewing trouble, Meredith requested Marshall's legal assistance. After Marshall finished laughing about Meredith's proposal to sue Old Miss, he washed his hands of the case. Marshall knew Motley had the smarts and the courtroom skills to get the job done, and he thought her gender might be an advantage. The fight to desegregate Old Miss might get someone killed, but in the context of Mississippi's white supremacist, yet chivalrous culture, as Marshall saw it, a Black woman would fare better than a Black man. Any white supremacist, he opined, would scarcely think twice about murdering a Black man, but might hesitate to lynch a Black woman. The very idea of a Black woman lawyer violently clashed with the worldview of Dugas Shands Esquire, the white male lawyer who defended Old Miss. Shands refused to address the Inc. Fund lawyer in the customary manner as Mrs. Motley. Instead, he used only indirect references, calling Motley her or she. At one point early on, Motley jumped to her feet in a bid to put an end to the charade. But the tipping point occurred when Shands called her Constance. Motley immediately objected. "I would like for Mr. Shands not to call me by my first name," Motley insisted. Henceforth, the lawyer referred to Motley as the New York counsel. After months of struggle and endless delays, Meredith had had enough. Browbeaten by white resistance, Meredith wrote to Motley, resigned. "I will not attempt to obtain an undergraduate degree from the University of Mississippi," the letter proclaimed. Keenly aware that Motley, who had poured herself into the case, would be disappointed in his decision, Meredith pleaded for understanding. "I am human after all," he said. Meredith had grown tired of waiting for a deliverance that never came. Life had passed him by. His peers had graduated from college, begun careers, and moved on with their lives. In the meantime, he and his family had endured a high cost fighting to integrate the University of Mississippi. Motley was stunned by the message. In order to salvage her case and support her client, she morphed from lawyer to therapist, a role she often played in high-stakes civil rights cases. To get a handle on the fraught situation, the pair would talk in Motley's New York City apartment, where Meredith could taste freedom. There, Motley cajoled Meredith. She persuaded him that he had gone too far and that too much had been invested in the case by the Inc. Fund and the Federal Court of Appeals to abandon the litigation. Just as Meredith reached his breaking point, support arrived precisely as Motley had promised. On September 10th, 1962, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black intervened, halting any further action preventing Meredith's matriculation to Old Miss. While in Mississippi, Motley built community with a small band of lawyers and activists who took part in LDF's effort to end Jim Crow in the state. She leaned on Medgar Evers, the NAACP's most prominent operative in Mississippi, who often invited Motley to his home, where she enjoyed home-cooked meals and fellowship with Evers, his wife, and their children. But only 1 month after Motley left Mississippi for the last time, Medgar Evers was assassinated. It devastated her. Motley couldn't get out of her bed for weeks following his death. She couldn't even bring herself to attend his funeral. Nevertheless, she had left the state victorious. Constance Baker Motley emerged as one of the most respected lawyers in America. A story in the New York Times titled "Integration's Advocate" captured the professional heights to which Motley had soared. A tall, striking woman with piercing dark eyes is almost always in the courtroom in the eye of the hurricane surrounding the struggle for civil rights in the South, the story read. Motley's fight to desegregate Ole Miss brought her public esteem and professional success, along with devastating loss and profound pain. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for writing this book. And thank you for being with us on the first day of Women's History Month and opening our month-long series, Your Voice, Your Power, Your Vote, Making Democracy Work. And so I think I'd like to begin with, we're talking about this being the topic for this program, the Long March to the White House. And could you connect the dots with, in terms of the work that Constance Baker Motley did her entire professional career around civil rights, and then connect for us that civil rights and the fact that we elected our first Black president, that we elected our first woman of color as vice president, and now the first Black woman is a nominee to the Supreme Court. I know that's chock full of a lot, but bring that to light for us.
Sure. Well, you can think of all of those firsts as a testament and affirmation of equal workplace equality. And Constance Baker Motley certainly is among the lawyers who made all of those steps possible, including the nomination of Judge Jackson to the US Supreme Court. It's been a long time coming, this nomination, and Motley is one of the people who, through her work as a civil rights lawyer, where she was path-breaking, and helped to litigate Brown versus Board of Education, helped to desegregate higher education in the South, helped to represent criminal defendants, civil rights protesters, Martin Luther King Jr. She paved the way for the Civil Rights Act, which is the predicate for all of these achievements. She also was a barrier-breaking politician, as the first Black woman elected to the New York Senate, and then the first woman Manhattan Borough president, where she pursued social change in a different way and different realm. And then in 1966 became the first Black woman to serve as a federal judge. She did all of these things. It was not easy for her. And I'm happy to talk about some of the impediments that she encountered, because many of them are still relatable and still occurring in our own time, including, as I've said in a number of venues in recent days, the ways in which the Judge Jackson's work in support of the Bill of Rights, the right to counsel for indigent criminal defendants, is being in some quarters weaponized against her. Motley experienced a similar phenomenon when her own path-breaking career as a civil rights lawyer was used to deprive her of the opportunity for service on a higher court. So Motley and her work for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and in other scenarios is all bound up with these moments. And we are delighted to be able to discuss her career and make it clear to everyone that she is a part of these moments. Too few people know about her tremendous impact on where we are today.
Thank you. In terms of those impediments, how did those impediments affect other civil rights leaders in terms of what have been some of those barriers that she faced and still achieved so much? And also, why are so many people just hearing about her for the first time now?
Well, let me start with the second part of your question. And I would say that gender is a reason, gender along with race are reasons that too few people know about Constance Baker Motley. You know, in our society, in Western society writ large, leadership and historical significance are coded male, as I say in my book. And so in American history broadly, men are centered, white men are centered. And then even in the history of the civil rights movement, men are centered, in this instance, African-American men. And to be clear, people like Thurgood Marshall and Martin Luther King Jr. are so deserving of being known and being studied. And yet, Javita, we can do two things at once. We can both recognize their historical significance and also recognize the importance of this incredible, remarkable woman lawyer, Constance Baker Motley. Now, in terms of the barriers she encountered, first of all, just starting with her young life, she was born to a working class family, immigrant family in New Haven, Connecticut, 1921. She grew up in the shadow of Yale University, and she was not expected to have a career, a professional career. Even her parents thought that she should do something like become a hairdresser, so something practical, because at that time, she was told repeatedly, women don't get anywhere in the law. And yet, because of role models who introduced her to the work of W.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, and lawyers like Abraham Lincoln, and also George Crawford, who was the corporation counsel for the city of New Haven, a Black man who also was an ally of the NAACP. She developed an interest in becoming a lawyer, coupled with her own interest in social activism, which was a byproduct of growing up during the Great Depression and seeing so much need. And then that her family didn't have money for her to go to college or law school. She was aided by a white philanthropist and ended up being able to go to law school because of his generosity. And was only able to enter Columbia Law School because she attended during World War II, when there were so many men missing from law school that institutions like Columbia actually let in a handful of women. And yet when she applied for jobs at Wall Street firms, she was turned away. Much like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sandra Day O'Connor and a number of women who became prominent and excellent lawyers were turned away. Thurgood Marshall hired her on the spot, gave her an opportunity to work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and she spent 20 years there. And yet, even in that context, she encountered difficulties, whether it was in the context of litigating these cases, like the one I read about, James Meredith, where people hadn't seen a woman lawyer or many Black lawyers, much less a combination of a Black woman lawyer. And so she encountered hostility, curiosity, and just kept going because she was a formidable person who had been taught by her family to think of herself as superior. And it created a protective shield for her, but also taught by Thurgood Marshall to just not react to the slights. And that served her well as an addition.
Thank you. Now I want to turn this a little bit about you. and the reason is because in many ways you've followed in terms of excelled in a career mostly of men. There have been, you are amazing in your own way. What were some of the barriers that you faced?
Well, you're very kind. I appreciate your interest and happy to talk about my journey to the extent that it's helpful to others. Well, I was a first generation college student, Jovita. And so I had parents who grew up under Jim Crow in the Deep South, and were very conscious of the opportunities that they had been denied. And from the time I was a little girl, promoted education as a pathway to excellence. So they wanted me to have what they didn't have, and helped me in every way that they could, including by, I was just a voracious reader as a child, and my parents made sure that I had books and encyclopedias. And it was in my encyclopedias that I actually discovered Thurgood Marshall and was inspired to a career in the law as a civil rights lawyer, because I could see all around me in the state of South Carolina, the unfinished journey towards equity for African Americans. And I, by having supportive parents, a supportive community, and mentors along the way, including in college, who supported my desire to go to graduate school. And I ended up going both to Duke to earn a PhD in history, and then to Yale to earn a law degree. And I had people who believed in me, and who promoted my aspirations. Now, I also had some people who were stumbling blocks. In fact, when I first landed in college, I always liked to write. And I encountered an individual who actually said to me, I was interested in being an English major, that Black people can't write. And it was just a bump. As it happens, I studied history, I studied political science. And for me, because I had such a strong foundation, in much the same way that Motley had a strong foundation, those things just, I could just brush it off, because I was so excited to learn, to better myself, to make my family and my community proud, and to be what I wanted to be, which was a lawyer. I earned my degree at Yale, as I mentioned. And, I would take from my story the importance of having mentors and sponsors who will support the aspirations of young people, of students, of women, of people of color. It is so vital. And so, in the same way that Constance Baker Motley was dedicated to being the first, but not the last, I think it's really important to be a mentor to students and to colleagues who are interested in pursuing this line of work.
I think that is so important, not being the last.
Yes.
To make sure that there are people who follow in our footsteps. That's very important. And I also think that one of the things that strikes me is I'm going to call it the word determination. Because the more somebody says that you can't do something, or at least for me, that you cannot do, I'm hard-headed. I want to do what somebody told me. No, you can't do that. So sometimes it's a motivating factor to say that you can't do. I remember I had an aunt who helped me and my 6 sisters. And when I told her I wanted to be a journalist, she said, Black women don't become journalists. Black people don't become journalists. Why don't you become a school teacher? And when she told me that I couldn't do that, I was more determined to do it. And quite interesting, my sisters and I, we are the 4th generation owners of our family farm in Prince Edward County, Virginia.
Oh, wow.
And Prince Edward, and maybe our audience doesn't know, Prince Edward County was one of the Brown v. Board of Education cases. So I thank you very much for your scholarship. And also, what would you tell young women who want to pursue a career in law? What would you tell them?
Well, one of the things that's really disappointing, even today, is how underrepresented African Americans in particular are in the field of law. And what I would say is, first of all, one has to be prepared. Law is a very challenging field, and you're at a disadvantage if you wait until late in the game to decide that you want to be a lawyer. So if it's something of interest, we should be encouraging students when they are in middle school, and certainly by the time they're in junior high and high school, to try to connect with lawyers. And if there are no, you should try to connect with whoever will see you and take an interest in you. And for women and people of color, you can't wait for same race, same gender role models. You have to take it where you can find it, get it where you can find it, and be bold in it. Javita, as I was saying to someone the other day, a student, there have been times in my life when I know I've just made people mentor me. People who they didn't know what to make of me. Well, a lot has to be done, and it's not fair, but nevertheless is true, to just relate to people on a human level and let them know that you do all the same things as they do, and you have your dreams and aspirations, and let's try to be in it together. So take challenging courses, reach out to people who are in the field, and you have to take risks and seize opportunities wherever you can find them.
Thank you. Let me see if there are any questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And at this point, there aren't. So then I'm going to go to my next question for you.
Okay.
Is, in writing your book, I know you mentioned desegregating Ole Miss. What were some of the other challenging cases that you write about in your book that Judge Motley Baker handled?
Sure. Well, let's go back to Brown versus Board of Education, the consequential constitutional law case that where the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that state mandated racial segregation in schools is unconstitutional. Well, yes, it was a tremendous victory for the NAACP lawyers, but it was not a self-implementing decision. And Motley writes about how, in addition to feeling triumphant after that case was decided, she was a little depressed because she knew, and the other lawyers knew, that there was a lot of work ahead of them in order to make Brown a reality in communities across the South. It was a hard-fought battle to actually desegregate the schools, with school districts, including in Virginia, as you know, you mentioned growing up in Prince Edward County, school districts closing their doors rather than desegregate. And so Motley was on the front lines of all of that work. And one of the things I want to mention is that in the period when she and the other lawyers were conducting the research for Brown that went into the arguments at the Supreme Court, she was pregnant and then on maternity leave. And then she had an infant and a toddler. She was doing all of that work while she was juggling her family life in a way that many women will find familiar. It's difficult to be a parent, full stop, and difficult to be a parent when one is engaged in this high-powered work. She did that. And to expand on that a little bit, and I do see a question in the chat about asking me to talk about Motley's family life. So on some of the trips, she had to travel from New York to wherever she needed to go. Sometimes she flew, but a lot of times she drove. And on one particular trip that I recount in the book, she takes her 3-year-old son and her husband along. They drive from New York to Florida. Now, they cannot stay in white-owned hotels or eat at white-owned restaurants. They have to depend on the kindness of Black families who will take them in. And that's what they do all the way during that 17-hour drive down to Florida. And when they leave one of these, it's Conrad Pearson and his family in Durham, North Carolina, they get back on the road. They need to get some gas and use the facilities. And she has the experience of a gas station owner depriving her young son, her 3-year-old son, of a bathroom, well, because he's a 3-year-old Black boy. And they learn after that incident to ask first if they can use the facilities. And if the gas station attendant says yes, then they'll pay for the gas. And if no, they'll keep going, keep on their way. So in addition to just the intellectual power that's required of her, she has to be brave. She has to be resilient in the face of things like that. And she is. And it's important to know. And to know also that she has a really supportive husband in Joel Wilson Motley. He takes care of the family. He's a real estate broker in Harlem, so he has flexibility around his work hours. He co-parents, and her entire family pitches in to help her do the work that she does. She has 11 siblings, and some of them are helping around the house when she's gone. And it's a really just a heartwarming story about family, community, and layered on top this story about the civil rights and women's rights movements.
Thank you. I'm seeing another question in the chat, and that question, let me see, it's navigating. Do you think white teachers in particular, because in Philadelphia, where the majority of teachers are white and about 70% are white women, can help assist with having Black students understand the need for more Black lawyers? And I think to digest that question, when you have majority Black students and then majority white women teachers, how does that impact the desires and influences that children need to even want to become a lawyer or a journalist or a doctor or any of these professions? And could you address that?
Sure. Well, first I will say that I do think it's important for the field of education to be diverse. So to have, African-American men and women and Latinas and the whole array representative people and perspectives represented in education. At the same time, I think it's vitally important for teachers, white women teachers, to meet their students where they are, and of course to introduce them to the possibilities that might lie ahead. And a part of that work could be bringing in guest speakers to talk to kids, and those speakers could be lawyers of color who might volunteer to address those communities, or trying to pair students in high schools with local mentors, or just introducing them at a basic level to the work of people like Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley. As I mentioned, I was inspired to become a lawyer through the example of Thurgood Marshall. And so I think that the basic thing that is needed is a desire to be helpful and a commitment to reach these students through the lens of hope and opportunity, as opposed to the deficit approach that all too often is the framework that is understood as the right one for low income, in particular, students of color. And so, yes, we can all do our part. And there are a lot of training materials these days for teachers who want to encourage diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And I would commend all of those ways to our teachers.
Thank you. There's a question in the Q&A portion. It's, what particular country or countries do you think are creating a society where everyone is being treated equally and fairly? Perhaps Americans could learn from and be inspired by these examples.
Interesting question. I don't know that I have a knowledge base about the particulars of various countries that would allow me to answer that question with a great deal of conviction. But I do know that there are those in the field of education in particular who look to other countries, a lot of them are Scandinavian countries, for best practices around engaging students, for instance, or around creating diverse communities. But, on the other hand, this is hard work. This is hard work. And as I found, and I actually taught education law and policy in particular, a lot of the examples of best practices tend to come from countries that are pretty homogenous. And so I do think that we in this country are on the front lines of trying to not only have a multiracial democracy in principle and in law, but in practice. And it is hard work. But there are people in communities around this country that are engaged in that work. And so, I am an optimist, I have to say, and I try to find those people in communities and lift them up and promote doing so on a wider scale throughout this country. We have to. In my view, we have to be, as President Obama used to say, that the ones that we've been looking for, right? Freedom is a constant struggle, and we all have to engage.
Thank you. I totally agree. And I guess in this moment in time, that inspiration has to be even more than it's been in our lifetime. And I think the more diverse our country becomes, the harder it becomes to maintain that optimism. But Harriet Tubman didn't let it turn her around. And so I'm thinking that the harder the struggle, the more determined we have to be. And so I will go to another question that's in the Q&A section. It says, what leaders do you admire the most and why?
What leaders do I admire the most? Well, I'll mention a couple. I am in right now, my role is higher education administration. And one of the people whom I admire a great deal is Ruth Simmons, who was the first Black president of an Ivy League institution at Brown University. And was instrumental in having that institution engage with its legacies with slavery. I happen to be chairing the Harvard committee that is looking at our legacies with slavery, and Ruth Simmons has been an inspiration. She also right now is the president of Prairie View A&M in Texas. And so she is just continuing to promote equity and inclusion in education. And I so admire her for all of the work that she's done for so many years. I will say that I admire the women who were a part of the consideration for President Biden when he was looking to nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court. Judge Jackson has such great, she has a great personal story. I understand her family's roots are in Georgia. She grew up in Miami, which is a city that has seen a lot of, it's a great international, globally connected and diverse city. It's also a city that's seen a lot of racial strife, including around issues in the criminal legal system. She's familiar with those. She's talked movingly about her family connections to those matters. And in this moment, when she's been nominated, I want to have all of us lift her up and support her. She is eminently qualified for this position, and I will look forward to seeing her have a seat on the Supreme Court. It's been a long time coming, and I'm happy the moment is finally here.
I think that it's been a long time coming, and a lot of us who are on this call today are looking forward to the day as well. And talking about who inspires you, bringing it back to Constance Baker Motley, what inspired you to write about her?
Yes, well, I began to think about writing a biography of Motley when I was writing my prior book on Atlanta and the long history of the civil rights movement, and engaged with Motley's career because she litigated the Atlanta school desegregation case all the way to the Supreme Court. I found her fascinating, and also noticed that there was at the time, relatively little literature about Motley, and I thought that was unfortunate, and wanted to do what I am doing now, just to share her story, her life, and her legacy with the world, both because it's a corrective to history. She had a tremendous impact. She should be known. As I said before, we can know about her along with many others who had an impact. It's also important to discuss and to lift up Motley, because those visible diversity is important. And so she inspired women like Kamala Harris, like my late colleague Lonnie Guinier, who was the first Black woman to earn tenure at Harvard Law School, who has talked movingly about encountering Motley through her representation of James Meredith when Motley would appear on TV, and being inspired by her. And so these models will inspire, I hope, other young girls, people of color, women, to think of themselves as capable of having an impact on the world. And for that reason, I commend her to everyone. She's an inspiration, personal inspiration to me as well.
To me too. And there's one more question in the chat. What are some ways that young women of color today can navigate their development when many companies look at diversity through majority women and other nationalities?
Mm-hmm. Well, I understand the question that is being asked, and I would look again to the importance of having role models available. And also, Javita, making people aware of the resources that are out there. And I'm not exactly sure what age group this person is asking about, but it's so vitally important to link young people to organizations in the community who are engaged in this work. Now, I am a member of the Links International, the Middlesex County chapter, and this is an organization of Black professional women, and we do a lot of work around mentoring and offer programming that is meant to inspire young people, support young people, scholarships to support individuals. And there are companies and other organizations that are interested in supporting communities of color, African Americans in particular. And we have to do a better job of connecting the populations in need of support and opportunities with the resources. That is an enduring project, an objective that we need to be committed to.
And it also reminds me of a former colleague who is now diversity, equity, and inclusion chief at the ACLU, who reminds me that if there is not a seat at the table, sometimes that table wasn't built for us. So sometimes we need to break that table and make a table of our own. So, which I thought that question reminded me of, because I understood the question also to look at diversity differently than we have in the past, and looking at it that in a way that it's not a matter of who are the people around that table, but whether or not they're the right people at the table. And so at this point, I want to thank you so very much for your scholarship, bringing us this wonderful, wonderful book. And if you do not have it, you ought to have it. It's Civil Rights, the Queen of Civil Rights, about Constance Baker Motley. There's information in the chat about the book. And are there other closing comments that you would like to give us?
Sure, and thank you again for having me here. It's my pleasure to discuss Motley's legacy with you and with the audience. I think the closing thought that I will offer is the one that I mentioned before, and that Motley's life really illustrates. That is the principle that freedom is a constant struggle. We all have to be involved. It's wonderful to have people like Motley and Judge Jackson and other models of achievement. However, actually lifting up entire communities requires all of us, wherever we find ourselves. There's great weight on these examples of excellence, Black excellence and female excellence, and we can take inspiration from them, but ultimately we have to do the work in our own communities. I have to do the work from my perch, and you are doing the work from your perch, and we just have to be mindful of digging in, having commitment, and putting our heads down and doing the work and supporting those who are in need in particular. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. And I'd like to remind our audience that this is the first program in our Women's History Month series, Your Voice, Your Power, Your Vote, Making Democracy Work. Next week, we will feature on next Tuesday, March 8th, feature the women of City Council. And we will be having a program every week. And I think the full schedule will be in the chat of our programs. And we will be closing out the month with Washington Post columnist and author Jennifer Rubin, who wrote the book, How Women Defended Democracy Against Donald Trump. So there's a lot to look forward to this month. And I thank, again, Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin for being with us today and opening the door for us to the legacy and life of my Shiro, Constance Baker Motley. And also I'd like to thank Saptarshi Dutt, who is our digital coordinator, who kind of helps put all of this stuff together. And I appreciate you, Saptarshi. And I appreciate Damie in your office, who made my life incredibly easy, and the commissioners on the Philadelphia Commission for Women. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. You as well.